I usually start this talk in Atlantean times. My view of Atlantis is that there's really very strong evidence that a whole area around the Azores Plateau was on the surface. And in fact, an area at least twice the size of Britain at the very smallest, and in fact probably many times that size. What may have happened is that Atlantis sank in parts, and the last part that sank was this final Azores Plateau. In fact, there are two Azores Plateaus. There's one higher up one, which is about twice the size of Britain, and then there's another plateau, and it goes further down to the seabed, and the bigger plateau would be many times the size. Now, why am I starting with Atlantis? That is because it has quite a considerable bearing on the ancient cultures of Britain, and particularly possibly the megalithic cultures. Because at that time, Britain was not an island, it was attached to the European continent. The North Sea didn't exist, the Channel didn't exist, we were connected to Scandinavia as well as to France and northern Germany. The Channel, incidentally, came into existence, it's usually thought, about 6000 BC. But the whole area was probably an Atlantean colony. The Atlanteans, almost certainly, their landmass extended either as far or nearly as far as the area, the continental shelf off the British Isles, which goes out way beyond Ireland, 200 or 300 miles beyond Ireland. You find the end of the continental shelf and it drops off. Well, that was then the edge of the continent. The sea level was much lower before 10,000 BC. And the northern or northeasternmost part of Atlantis either joined onto or nearly joined onto this northwestern European continental Atlantis. So we were a sort of colony of Atlantis, probably. Now, there are also other connections, also other civilizations we may have been connected with in ancient times. Anyway, there seems to be a general consensus that those who believe in an Atlantis at all, that it went down around 10,000 BC. Plato is the main authority, of course, for Atlantis, and he says 9,000 years before Solon was told this tale, or rather came back with this tale from Egypt and was told them by the Egyptian priests. That was 500 BC, and 9,000 years before that puts it at 9,500. Probably about this time there was some kind of cosmic catastrophe. Otto Mook argues in his book that an asteroid from the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter hit the Earth. He goes into great detail and a great deal of evidence for this. He finds two large holes in the western Atlantic off the eastern seaboard of the southern United States. And these holes are definitely there. You would find them in any oceanographic map. He says that the asteroid broke in half just before landing in the Atlantic, and that he reckons it was I think he says 6 miles in diameter. That would mean that when it was resting on the bottom of the deepest part of the Atlantic, 2/3 of it would still be above the surface, which makes you can see what size we're talking about. He also finds a trail of craters going across the southeastern part of the United States, mainly Georgia, and ending up with Charleston. And this is a known fact, that there are this line of craters. And what seems to have happened is that, if his argument is correct, this enormous body came in over the United States, peeling off, white hot of course, peeling off bits of it which landed on the ground as it went, leaving a great trail, breaking in half and then plunging into the Atlantic. He finds a passage from the Maya which describe a serpent in the sky with a fiery head, and he says, well, this is it, and it does really read very much like it. What happened then was probably something like this. The plates of the Earth rest on a sort of semi-liquid magma, or rather like thick black treacle, as you probably know. And the Earth is composed, the crust is composed of a great many tectonic plates, as you probably know too. And what is called continental drift theory explains how these plates have been, the continental landmass parts have been drifting apart for 200 million years, and that America used to fit into the European landmass. He examines this theory and he accepts it, but he says there was an important bit left out. In fact, they don't fit together. There's quite a considerable section that doesn't fit. There's just a gap. And he says this was Atlantis. What happened was when the two parted, this bit was left in the middle. Also, of course, there could well have been, after the parting, other parts of the land beneath the top plates could have come up and formed part of the landmass anyway. So this continental drift theory does not go against Atlantis at all. on the whole it supports it. And what would have happened with a thing of this size, 6 miles in diameter, it would have penetrated through the Earth's crust. It would have caused great pressure on the semi-liquid magma underneath and pushed it in such a way that it would have spurted up at all the joints between the plates, and there would have been a vast mass of water vapour, pumice stone shot through with gases so that it floated and was very light, went up into the atmosphere and came down and floated in a great thick mass on the top of the sea. And other oily substances, all the magma, of course, the volcanic lava and so on, would have spewed out into the atmosphere. And Atlantis, he says, the actual island of the Azores Plateau, is a little mini tectonic plate of its own, sort of triangular. And he says that it would have created a vacuum underneath this mini tectonic plate, and the whole plate would have sunk down, anything up to 2 miles. Meanwhile, there's the sinking of Atlantis. 2 important consequences followed from this, both of which had drastic consequences for ancient Britain, what was to become ancient Britain. One was that the Gulf Stream, which had previously hit Atlantis in the mid-Atlantic and been diverted, some of it north and some of it south, so that none of it had reached what was to become Britain, was suddenly released with the sinking of Atlantis and reached northern Europe. So that the isotherm, that is to say the temperature point at which water becomes ice, which used to be about the same latitude in Canada as in Europe, suddenly was pushed up in Europe, so that, as you know, you can go far further north in Europe without meeting ice. Canada is far colder, although it's on the same latitude as Britain. So suddenly, northwestern Europe was suddenly dramatically unfrozen. The ice had come down as far as the River Thames, as Bristol. This part of Britain was not covered by ice in the last ice age. It was pretty cold, mind you, and pretty impossible for anyone to live here. I mean, a few cavemen perhaps, but nothing very much. But the ice was suddenly melted by this Gulf Stream arriving in northwestern Europe. The other thing that happened as a result of this, of course, the Gulf Stream went on right up to the north, as you probably know. Even Murmansk is ice-free part of the year in northern Russia, and that's solely because of the Gulf Stream. What happened was much of the northern ice cap was melted. All this ice suddenly melted and went into the ocean, and what happens to the ocean when it receives a lot of ice? It rises in level. And it's a known fact that the water level rose at about this time. Scientists generally agree on this. There's no dispute about this at all. They just don't know the reason. It rose between 150 and 600 feet. The estimates are all different. Let's take the average of those estimates, 300 feet. You've got nearly the height of St. Paul's Cathedral there. This rising in water level suddenly made Britain into an island. It didn't happen all at once. Of course, all the ice didn't all melt at once. But by about 6000 BC, we were an island. The Channel and the North Sea had come into existence. The other drastic effect upon Britain was climate-wise, because all this vast mass of water vapour that went into the air, that came down in the form of enormous downpours of rain all over the world, which, together with the flooding of all the coastal lands because of the rising in the sea level, gave rise to all the flood legends, and you get them all around the world. Universally you get flood legends, the Aztecs, the Mayas, the Incas of Peru and the pre-Incas, the Chinese. All over the world you get these flood legends. Not only water vapour went into the air, but also a vast mass of dust, volcanic magma and so on. The dust largely obscured the sun. For anything up to 2,000 or 3,000 years, the sun's rays were largely cut off. This is interesting because Plato says, in his account of Atlantis, that it sank in one terrible day and one terrible night. And he says that after that, the sea in the Atlantic, or beyond the Pillars of Hercules, which meant the Straits of Gibraltar, that's how he put it, was so muddy as to be impassable. Now, most people think that's just crazy, because after all, the Atlantic is 2 miles deep. You would never get enough mud to fill up 2 miles of ocean. But, of course, if you think of pumice stone floating on the surface, and a great deal of mud on top of that, then you get probably what actually happened. And it probably was impassable for the ships of those days, the sort of square-rigged sailing ships that didn't have much power, and depending largely on oars, which wouldn't get through the pumice stone. It was probably impossible to sail past the Straits of Gibraltar from anything up to thousands of years after that. So what is the picture that we have then for the megalithic Britain, let's say we're really going to take up, from now on, I'm going to take up the story from the beginning of known historical facts about ancient Britain, which is about 4000 BC. What picture do we have by that time? We have a world that was devastated by this asteroid hitting, the sun's rays being cut off, a long dark age, particularly over Europe, as the prevailing winds would have brought the dust cloud over Europe, for probably thousands of years after this. Very little vegetation, we know this for a fact. In fact, the vegetation between about 10,000 and 5,000 BC was extremely sparse and poor. And very little prospect of any kind of civilization. The Greeks called the Hyperboreans the people of the north, or literally beyond the north wind is what the word means. They said they lived in a land of Hades, or shades, shady and rather shady in both senses of the word, I mean metaphorically as well as literally, a very dangerous place to be. And a lot of scholars think that the Hyperboreans are the English and possibly the Northern Europeans as well, and that the reason they became part of Greek mythology rather than factual knowledge was because no Greeks ever penetrated that area because it was such an awful place to be. At least in very ancient times it was. By the time of Plato, the classical Greeks, things must have cleared up, because there were Greeks who did in fact get as far as Britain. There was Pythias of Marsala, which is Marseille, and he sailed up to Britain, in fact gave a considerable description of Britain in the 4th century BC, and then went on to Altamar Thule, which is probably Iceland. So by that time, things were probably reasonably livable in, we had a reasonable climate again. So what happened then between about 4000 BC and the time of Pythias, which was about 400 BC? What seems to have happened is we know very little up to 4500. Then we have the first of the megalithic monuments. They're mostly in Ireland, these very ancient ones. The most famous one is at Newgrange. That's dated 4500 BC. That's what's called a passage grave. But it's more than that. It's certainly a place for celebrations of the midwinter solstice, because at that point, or is it midsummer? It may be both. At that point, the sun's rays go along a long passage and reach a specially designated point at the end. So here you have people who are beginning to become aware of the importance of the solstices. Now, after that, we had the raising of the great megaliths. You had Stonehenge, which started about 2500 BC, and the big stones were built about 1500 to 1800 BC. Avebury was about 2000 BC. As you probably know, it's rather more impressive than Stonehenge. It's an enormous circle with two smaller circles and sort of snake-like avenues leading away from it. Some people have suggested that it is the snake within the circle, which is a very esoteric symbol, or a snake interpenetrating a circle. Then you have about 600 other stone circles, or standing stones, or other stone monuments. They were researched exhaustively by Professor Alexander Thom. He was a professor of engineering at Oxford, and he shocked his colleagues by embarking on this sort of pilgrimage around no less than 600 sites, and he worked out the geometry of them, and he found that instead of being just approximate circles, or ovals and nothing, instead of there being nothing very scientific in them, as everybody had assumed, that they were based on a very scientific system. He found that they used a standard unit of measurement, which was 2.72 feet, which he called the megalithic yard. And he found that they were orientated very exactly, allowing for the precession of the equinoxes. You know what that is? If you allow for the fact that the Earth, while spinning, is also going around on its axis, rather like a spinning top that's been knocked slightly off and goes around like that while it's spinning very fast at the same time. Well, that's what's happening. People often thought that the rising of the sun over the heel-stone at Stonehenge was inaccurate until they allowed for the precession of the equinoxes, and they found it was exactly accurate. And now we find that it goes to the left-hand, even allowing for that, it goes to the left-hand side of the heel-stone, but now they realise that there were two heel-stones, and it went exactly between the two, even to right down the middle. They've found evidence of another heel-stone. I don't know if you know that. That's a very recent discovery. So they were very precise in their measurements. They also appear to have been able to measure the lunar eclipses and even a lunar cycle that lasts 56 years. Apparently every 56 years the moon appears to make a rather peculiar movement. And that was beyond the average lifespan of a person in those days. And people died at 40 or 50 for the most part. So they must have been having exact knowledge which they handed on. And either they must have learnt it by heart or written it down. Or we don't think they had writing. So maybe they learnt it by heart. Or maybe they did have a secret form of writing that we haven't discovered. In fact, Caesar says they used Greek. It's not generally known, but he says the Druids used Greek. Also, we know there was a mysterious form of writing, or symbolic notching, which is called ogam, was in use, and people don't really know what it was. Bits of it have been sort of speculatively translated. They've also found it now, very controversially, in the United States. The East Coast is the United States. They've also found Phoenician there too, which is interesting because the Phoenicians were, of course, the Philistines, more or less, of the Bible. They were allied to them. They were along the same coastline. And well, what are they doing in the United States? So, anyway, getting back to the picture I was drawing, people who were capable of a very exact science of predicting and working out and pointing exactly to things like lunar eclipses, solar eclipses, of course, the equinoxes and the solstices, and other phenomena, certain stars as well. The pyramids, of course, in Egypt show the same degree of exactness. You see one of the tunnels in the Great Pyramid, in fact, points to the pole star. It's not actually something you can look through because it's blocked off at the bottom. It goes at right angles like that, or about not right angles. It takes an angle like that. They couldn't have used it as a telescope, but it's a symbolic pointing to the North Star, pole star. Now, if they had this degree of exactness, what was it for? Were they simply interested in the stars? I think it was much more than that. Firstly, they had to keep the seasons, as you were both saying. They had to, for the uses of their own agriculture, they had to know when one season started, another one ended. All right, fair enough, but what else? Well, I think they were astrologers. They believed that they probably had a primitive form of the zodiac. It's known that the Babylonians had it, way back 2,000 or 3,000 BC. And I don't think there's any reason why the pre-Druids shouldn't have had it. We know that there were contacts between East and West. We know that Pythagoras, who almost certainly knew about the zodiac, was visited by a Druid, because we have that statement in Greek writings. We know that Hecataeus was aware that there was a great temple of the sun in the land of the Hyperboreans, because he described it, and it was almost certainly either Stonehenge or Glastonbury Tor, depending on whether you translate it as being circular or globular. Geoffrey S. tells me it should be translated globular. In any case, the ancient Greeks, you see, had astrology to a highly developed degree. We know they had contacts with the British Druids. It seems to me highly unlikely that the Druids and the pre-Druids didn't have it. Now, people often say, well, the Druids were fairly recent. They didn't come along to about 500 BC. But I think that they were far older than that, really. And they may not have been called that before that time. But there was a very ancient caste of elite priests, really, wise men. And this brings me to the next point. Probably ancient Britain was a sort of theocracy, that is to say, it was ruled by its priests. The evidence rather points in that direction. You see, if Stonehenge was built for a religious purpose, they've now found at Darrington Walls the place very close to Stonehenge, which was probably a gigantic priest house. In fact, I've been there with an archaeologist, and he said it has all the hallmarks of being a place for priests. So, all the evidence is that these ancient monuments were used for religious purposes, and that it was an elite group of priests, Druids or pre-Druids. It wasn't, of course, the Druids who built Stonehenge. It was probably some priestly caste before the Druids. It was usually said to have been built by the Beaker people. That simply means that they brought a particular type of jug, which caused them to be named the Beaker folk, with them. That really doesn't say anything at all. Archaeologists have a way of inventing very unromantic names for these tribes. And if you call them the ancient Celtic pre-Druidic warrior priests or something, it sounds much more romantic, maybe more accurate as well. So, they had astrology and probably used it systematically. Now, does anyone imagine they could have used the stone circles for anything else, apart from astrology and apart from, finding out the crops, the seasons of the year for their agriculture? I can't think of anything else.
Well, as these sort of stations for extraterrestrial people to recognise.
Yes, now this view has been put forward by this classic book, John Michel's book, The Flying Saucer Vision. The Flying Saucer Vision is more speculative. It's extremely interesting because what it does is he takes the theme that you've stated and he then compares it with some modern UFO contactee cases like Howard Menger and others, and the things they were told are very much mystical, symbolic things. I mean, even the Grail actually comes into some of these contactee cases. A chalice sort of magically appears before them, and they're told the same sort of things as you get in the Grail stories of Arthur and his knights about a mystical quest and how there are only volunteers here on Earth and they're here for a particular purpose. And they're sometimes referred to as Knights of the Solar Cross, those souls who wander from planet to planet and incarnate on planets where the people there are in danger of being lost and in danger of being submerged by materialism and so on. And it's all very romantic, but it's very much a sort of cosmic version of Arthur and the Round Table. And it seems to me that if modern people who seem to be contacted by space beings, if that's what they are being given these messages, couldn't ancient people have been given them as well? Now, this theory has been developed to a very high degree by a man called Robert Temple. The theory is that beings from Sirius visited us in about 3000 BC, I think he says. Not sure about that date, but anyway, it's definitely well BC. He sets it in West Africa. There's a tribe there called the Dogon. This tribe has extraordinary knowledge of the Sirius star system. For example, they know that there is not only Sirius A, which you can see with the naked eye, but an almost invisible star called Sirius B. Now, this is what's called a white dwarf. That is to say, it's very massive, but also very small diameter, so that you can't see it at all except with the most powerful telescope. But it was first sighted by astronomers in 1863 with a very large telescope. They have known it for several hundreds of years, and there's no doubt about this at all, because a French anthropologist who actually lived with them for about 20 years and got to know them as well as their own family did so much research into their ancestry, and many of the artifacts which they had, the sort of painted objects and things which were depicting Sirius, date from the Middle Ages. And there's no doubt about this at all. So how did they know this hundreds of years before we found out about Sirius B? They also knew that Sirius B went round Sirius A every 50 years, or 50-point-something years. They've got this exactly correct. They knew all about the properties of a white dwarf star. They knew that, well, they're still there. They know, though they're rapidly disappearing, I'm afraid, as happens to most tribes nowadays as civilization comes in, but there's still a few of them left. They know that a white dwarf is incredibly massive and yet very small and has immense gravity. They also claim to know that there's a third body in the Sirius system, either another sun or a very large planet. Now, this was briefly cited in the 1920s by astronomers. It's not been seen since, but they think it's there. Even we haven't yet fully confirmed that, and yet they appear to have known this for hundreds of years. There's many other things they say. They say, for example, they call the beings from Sirius Nomo. They say that they were amphibious beings, and they say that when they came down, a new star appeared in the sky when the Nomo arrived. This was their big spaceship, they say. They then say a smaller object detached from it and came down to the ground. The big star remained there in the sky. Then when the Nomo left, many years later, after teaching them all their civilization, their arts and so on, and their science, they went back, and the smaller object went back and joined with the big object, and then the big object flew away, and the star disappeared. They put all this in detail. Now, if we have this account, you see, by a tribe who didn't write this down, but they had, I don't know if you know this, but the primitive tribes have such exact knowledge that they repeat it from generation to generation. They don't get a single word wrong. So they have this ability to pass things on. And I think if one realizes that, one is a bit less skeptical about these myths and legends. One doesn't have to write something down to pass it on in exact form. And it's the same with the sayings of Jesus. I mean, this argument has been going on for years and years. But the people of that time had this extraordinary ability to remember and repeat verbatim what a certain prophet said. And it's not only with Jesus, it's with Muhammad and the other early prophets as well. And so there's no real reason to disbelieve that we have, for the most part, Jesus' own words. What all this is coming round to is that we may have been visited by extraterrestrial beings, and we have the one case that is well documented in this Dogon case, the Sirius mystery. The point being that you only need one good case for the whole possibility to be opened out. So we've got three possibilities then. We've got for the megaliths. One is that it was to help their agriculture by telling them the seasons. Another is for astrology. And another is to attract or give some kind of message to space beings or space gods, or in some way preserve in stone something that they've been told by space beings. It's even suggested that Stonehenge was designed to look like a flying saucer. I'm not sure that you'll be convinced by that one, and I'm not sure that I am. If you look just at the central bit of Stonehenge, it is remarkably like. You could even say the Aubrey holes represent portholes. Well, some people think that's a bit extravagant. If one of these craft did land in ancient times, there's no question it would have been worshipped as a god. So it might well be that spacemen landed and they regarded them as gods and built something in their image, or perhaps they were told what star they came from and so aligned their monument onto that star. Because a lot of these circles have outside them further stones with an alignment to a particular star, not to the solstice at all, but to some star. And there's no known reason why it should be that particular star, but there may be a reason, something of that sort. So those are three possible explanations. Has anyone read either of these two books, or know about them? Either Lay Hunter's Companion by Paul Devereux and Ian Thompson, or Needles of Stone by Tom Graves. There are two rather different approaches. Paul Devereux has done work on the actual alignments themselves, and he has found many more than the usually estimated numbers of alignments. I mean, most people know about the Michael line that goes from St Michael's Mount in Cornwall and up through Avebury and, now I must get this right, Glastonbury Tor, Avebury, not Stonehenge, ends at Bury St Edmunds in Suffolk, and goes through various other places dedicated to St Michael, like Brentor, on the way up through Devon. And it's usually called the Michael line. That one is very convincing. It's one of the few really convincing ley lines that few people can dispute if they see it on a map. But there are lots more that are just not known about, and nobody's ever really thought of researching some local areas. But in fact, he's been all over the country and has found one after another case where you have up to 6 or 7 or 8 things all on a straight line. I mean, you can look through this for yourself. And also, there's a very remarkable parallel in Bolivia. Has anyone heard of the lines of Nazca, Peru and Bolivia? Now, the lines of Nazca, which actually are just into Peru, I think, are very spectacular. And they're the ones that everybody knows about. What isn't generally known is that all over other parts of Peru and Bolivia, there are many more straight paths. Not quite as spectacular as the lines of Nazca, because they don't have all the beautiful patterns of spiders and sort of scorpions and things. But there are lots of other single paths that go for miles and miles and miles, dead straight. So here we have a country on the other side of the world where, for some reason, a completely alien culture may have, well, probably I'd hardly heard of Britain, but there might have been some connections, was creating these straight lines. Now, has anyone got any ideas? There are many theories of these ley lines, what they would have been for. What Tom Graves says, and he does it by dowsing, Paul Devereux has done the sort of map work and the going out and about, but he's not very sensitive to the dowser. But Tom Graves has sort of followed some of the paths that Devereux has worked out with a dowsing rod, and he uses the L rods that come together like that, mostly. And he has found that, in his opinion, ley lines are two streams of energy. One goes underground, the other goes overground. The overground one is about the height of a pylon, I mean 20 feet up or so, or perhaps not quite as high as the wires on the pylon. And he says that they usually go, you have a circle, and it usually hits the edge of that circle, and it somehow plugged into the energy. I don't know whether it's rotating energy. I think he says it is, that it goes from one stone round a circle and then joins onto the line. And he thinks, or implies, that the energies may have been created by the stone circles rather than the stone circles simply marking out energy points. They actually created the energies. He doesn't say they created them from scratch. What he says is there are subterranean energies, mainly caused by underground streams, and where they cross you have a strong energy point. And what they did was, another man called Guy Underwood wrote a book about this called The Pattern of the Past. He was another dowser. And he doused out white horses as well, all sorts of other things. And he found that they were built upon these underground streams, intersections of them where the energies came up, and he could sense these energies as a dowser. Now, what I think from these various writers, my feeling is that, firstly, ancient man was a great deal more psychic and intuitive than we are today, or at least he could develop it to a great extent than we can, because he didn't have all the paraphernalia of modern technology to worry about. I mean, he was in a natural environment, and so this side of him came to the fore. And that's what we usually associate with the right-hand side of the brain. The sort of intuitive side was probably much more developed. This is what modern psychology is saying, the sort of new psychology. Left-hand side is supposed to be the logical and the intellectual, and the right-hand side is the intuitive. Well, obviously the right-hand side of ancient man's brain was much more developed. It was much more intuitive. He was aware of these forces. He was probably a natural dowser. Probably many of these ancient priests and people were natural dowsers. They probably didn't require sticks. They probably just felt it. Some dowsers today do that. They don't always need sticks, actually, do they? And so he followed the natural forces that he felt coming up from the ground. And where he felt a particularly strong point, he put in a stone, and this would lead the forces from under the ground up through the stone. Modern equipment has actually sensed this going round and round, sevenfold, in a sevenfold spiral, and then up above the stone. And in some way they were making use of these energies. And when there was a circle, something like Stonehenge, according to Guy Underwood, there's lots of intersections of streams underneath Stonehenge. It was a particularly powerful point. And yet they were doing it on, as we just were saying earlier, on an astronomical and astrological basis. How does one join these two things up? Well, my feeling is that probably ancient man was aware of the fact that if you took the underground energies and the energies from the stars and combined them, you've got a particularly powerful point, quite apart from possibly appealing to space gods or other beings who they believe. So, this would be a point where if you said your prayers to whatever gods they believed in, and we know they were animists and believed that in all nature there were gods, in everything, in streams and rocks and pathways and trees, they all had their gods and their fairies and so on. So if they could invoke the spirits and the gods much more effectively, perhaps healing was done too in these circles. I think that's quite likely. Perhaps telepathy, with one person sitting in one circle and another psychic in another circle, say 100 miles away or something like that. So I think all sorts of psychic and clairvoyant purposes to which they could have been put, in addition to straightforward ritual. I'm quite sure, the great avenues leading up to Stonehenge and Avebury, I'm quite sure there were rituals of all kinds as well. And probably something akin to the Greek mystery plays, where you have to go through a sort of initiation procedure. That is the best I can get to a synthesis of what the megaliths were for.